This is the Lofree Hypace, a very unique magnesium/ABS plastic mouse, which according to Lofree is the world's first built on-frame lightweight gaming mouse. This mouse was designed from the ground up to be different from the countless safe shapes quote-unquote you'll find on the market, so while the mouse's design and shape are very unusual, the mouse is equipped with top-of-the-line specs, just packaged in a rather unique frame. Now Lofree's mice historically have always had some unique design or features that make them stand out from the competition, and while the Hypace is a much more normal mouse compared to their previous releases, the mouse still maintains that special design and feature trend, just in a more gaming optimized way. And to my surprise, while I had very low expectations for this mouse, it actually really surprised me. And over my testing, the mouse performed surprisingly well, but when compared to other similar spec gaming mice, the Hypace falls short in many ways as the unique design sadly hamper the mouse's gaming use case, but the on-frame design is quite well executed and has some very interesting potential. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to take a deep dive into Lofree's latest release and talk all about the Hypace's unique shape, its on-frame design, as well as its pros and cons, and much more. But before we get into it, a big thank you to Lofree, who was kind enough to send over the Hypace over for review early. And as always, for all mice to cover here on the channel, I will have a full in-depth teardown guide for the Hypace coming out soon. So if you want to see how this mouse is built on the inside, what modding options there are for this mouse, as well as how this mouse's on-frame design works, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the Hypace's teardown video. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. In terms of testing parameters, I tested the Hypace for approximately 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming. Due to the mouse's unique shape and very limited skate install areas, I only used the included stock skates over my testing, as aftermarket compatibility was pretty poor here. And for sensitivity, I used my usual range of 40 to 50 cm per 360. For pricing, the Hypace as of recording this video is up for grabs on Kickstarter with an early bird price of $109 USD, which you can secure by pledging $1 USD. After the backing period ends, there will be incrementally increased prices until the mouse launches, at which the Hypace will retail for $199 USD. Currently, the mouse is only available in 2 colorways, a translucent black and a gray-orange colorway, the one I have today. Now before I talk about in-game performance, I wanted to quickly mention that unlike Lofree's previous mice, the Hypace is being advertised as a high-performance gaming mouse, not a general use or office mouse like their previous releases. And because of this, I'll be comparing the Hypace's performance directly against similarly spec'd gaming mice. I also wanted to clarify that while Lofree is advertising that the Hypace is a magnesium and ABS plastic mouse, the only part of the mouse that is actually made of magnesium is the inner framing. The rest of the mouse is majority ABS plastic, including the outer pieces. Alright, and with that out of the way, let's talk about performance. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse did actually impress me in terms of its performance, as it's good enough to compete with most of the popular gaming mice on the market, but where this mouse falls short is its shape, as its elongated oval-like shape is very weird to say the least, and combined with the mouse's forward sensor position, the mouse does feel very odd in the hand and definitely takes a couple days to get accustomed to. But even once you get accustomed to the shape and the forward sensor, the mouse is so thin it's actually very easy to tilt the mouse too far when moving the mouse horizontally, which can cause myriad of tracking issues. And these on-frame shell pieces, which are made out of ABS plastic, don't have a coating on them. So this unique shell shape is not only tricky to hold in your hand, it's also extremely slippery, especially when you use the Hypace for its intended gaming use case. So aftermarket grip aids are a must here, especially if you plan on using the Hypace for gaming due to the shell's slipperiness. The mouse's stock skates, as I kind of alluded to earlier, are also interesting, and not only does their thinness add to the mouse's tilting issues, they're very odd in terms of their friction due to their 4-piece design. And even though the skate cutouts are compatible with some types of aftermarket skates, since they're so thin, aftermarket skates make the tilting issue on the Hypace even worse. But on the plus side, the mouse's sensor implementation is fantastic, and the unit does support both wired and wireless high polling rates, both of which are surprisingly well implemented, and the forward sensor position, once you get accustomed to it of course, does perform surprisingly well, but sadly the lack of coating, the odd shape, the tilting issues, and a couple other aspects of this mouse does heavily hamper the Hypace's advertised gaming use case. So overall, the Hypace's gaming experience is less than ideal, despite this being the advertised use case for this mouse. And in my opinion, the Hypace feels much more like a showpiece or a high-tech office mouse, just with top-of-the-line specs stuffed into it, which makes this mouse feel a little confusing and doesn't really justify the mouse's pricing in my opinion, as for a gaming mouse there are far too many design issues with this mouse. Now before I talk about the Hypace's unboxing experience, please note that my unit is a pre-release version and the final retail version's packaging and accessories might differ from mine. Now the Hypace comes in this rather large flatter box. This is probably the biggest packaging I've ever seen for a mouse to date. Inside we have a large translucent cover with some Lofree branding across it, and under it we have the mouse itself. And also we have the largest 8K polling dongle I have ever seen to date. This thing is massive. I'm not exactly sure why Lofree made the dongle so big. I assume this is more of an aesthetic thing, but regardless, the dongle does have a decent weight to it and it has rubber pads on its base, so it does anchor itself to desktops pretty well, but it just looks a little odd compared to the normal dongles you see included with many gaming mice. Inside the little folio here we have a full multi-language user manual, a Lofree branded QC tag which is nice to see, as well as a full set of dyed PTFE skates which you will need to install in the mouse prior to use as the mouse doesn't come with any skates pre-installed. And lastly we have a small black box which includes a thicker, rather rigid USB A to C cable. Unfortunately, the mouse doesn't come with any grip tape, which is rather disappointing as the mouse's shell is quite slippery, and I'd love to see Lofree include grip tape with the mouse on release, especially considering how slippery the shell is, its intended use case, and the mouse's MSRP. Now before I talk about build quality and QC, as a reminder my Hypace was sent out to me directly by Lofree, so take my QC and build quality claims here with a grain of salt. Now in the hand the mouse does actually feel quite good, and the inner magnesium frame does keep the mouse's shell decently rigid, but the side plastic pieces do have some creaking and flexing to them, especially when pressure is directly applied to them. The mouse's main clicks do feel decent and they are using a rather unique switch which we'll talk more about later. The side buttons are also okay, but due to their weird design they're a little wobbly. The scroll wheel is also quite unique too, being a thinner, larger design, but it actually feels quite decent. And over my testing, I didn't run into any technical issues with the mouse, and all the connectivity types were well implemented and functioned perfectly fine. And the QC on my Hypace also seems pretty good too, and there are no noticeable issues with my unit. Alright, and in terms of weight, according to Lofree, the Hypace went through an extensive optimizations to reduce the mouse's weight. Their first sample weighed approximately 60 grams and they managed to cut that down to around 47 plus minus 2 grams, but keep in mind this weight does not include the stock skates. Now my unit in its stock configuration without the stock skates weighs exactly 48.7 grams, and with the included skates the mouse weighs 49.3 grams, 0.3 grams over its advertised weight spec. But despite this, I do actually think the weight here is quite good. It definitely could be reduced in a variety of ways, but for Lofree's first gaming mouse, 49.3 grams is perfectly fine in my opinion. And in terms of balancing, unlike most symmetrical mice which are centrally balanced, the Hypace is forward balanced, being balanced right at the mouse's sensor location, which is something I'm very happy to see, as oftentimes when we see companies release mice with forward sensor positions, like the Hitscan Hyperlight for example, they don't match the balancing point to the sensor. So I do have to give props to Lofree here for not falling into the same trap that many other brands do when they release mice with forward sensor positions, and this is a great attention to detail from them. And to clarify, the mouse is evenly balanced on its y-axis as well, and the tilting issues I mentioned earlier are more caused by the thinness of the shell, not any balancing related fault. Next up, let's talk shape. As I mentioned earlier, the Hypace's shape is very unique, arguably the most unique shape we've seen released in 2025 so far, being an elongated oval-like shape that's thinner at the top than the rear. Now, according to Lofree, the Hypace's shape went through 53 iterations to ensure that the mouse's shell is comfortable and ergonomically optimized. Now, while that may be the case for the development group, in reality, as I mentioned earlier, the shell is very odd, which does heavily affect the mouse's hand and grip compatibility, but we'll talk more about this later. In terms of dimensions, Lofree says that the Hypace measures 121.41 millimeters long, 62.7 millimeters wide, and 37.94 millimeters tall. But keep in mind that the lower region of the shell is slightly thicker, and the upper region of the shell is thinner, measuring approximately 46 millimeters wide. The shape of the mouse is a symmetrical shape, right-hand optimized as the side buttons are installed on the left side of the mouse. You could technically use this mouse with your left hand if you wanted to, but you won't have access to side buttons in doing so. Now before I talk about the mouse's shell profiles, I want to quickly talk about the potential advantages to this mouse's on-frame design. Now according to Lofree, they went through 32 versions of this magnesium framing, finally setting on the current iteration. Now to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the mouse's current shape, but Lofree could do something very unique here with this on-frame design in selling alternative shell pieces for the Hypace. This would allow for some customization with this mouse to make the shape better suited for some grip styles, and it will also help address the mouse's tilting issues as thicker side pieces with skates on their base could help stabilize the mouse better. So while the current on-frame build here on the Hypace is rather underwhelming, due to the unique design, Lofree could make the Hypace a semi-modular mouse, which is something I hope they look into, as the mouse's specs and performance is great. The biggest issue with it is just its shape. So hopefully Lofree takes advantage of the mouse's on-frame design, but we'll have to wait and see what they do in the future. In terms of shell profiles, looking at the Hypace from top down, we can see its symmetrical shape with its elongated oval-like shape as I mentioned earlier, and we can also see that the frontmost region of the mouse thins out significantly more than the back of the mouse. Looking from the base again, we can see the oval-like symmetrical shape of the mouse, but most interestingly we can see that the mouse is almost entirely empty, as the mouse's PCB and base framing only takes up about half the mouse's shell and the rest of it is completely empty, which does lead me to believe there could be some interesting modding potential for the Hypace's PCB, but we'll talk about that later. Looking from the sides, we can see the Hypace's shell profile, which is a rear terminating design, peaking slightly behind the mouse's physical midline, around 13mm down from the mouse's sensor and balancing point. We can also see that the side profile decline is much softer and gradual towards the front of the mouse and much more aggressive towards the rear. And from the front, we can see the rather unique front profile I mentioned earlier, and we can best see the side shell's design, which while being inwardly curved are mostly flat aside from some slight rounding on their sides later down in the shell. And from the rear of the mouse we can best see the hump shape, which is a more peak-like design. It just doesn't have a peak since the shell is separated into these two separate pieces. And we can also see that the side pieces, while they were mainly flat towards the front of the shell, are much more pronounced and much more rounded towards the rear of the shell, adding an ergonomic flare out to the side profile of the mouse. Alright, in terms of contact areas, as I mentioned earlier, due to the mouse's unique shape and design, this mouse feels rather odd in the hands, but again, according to Lofree, this was by design as they wanted to feel very different from the safer shapes that dominate the market. Now for my 1905 by 12.7 hands using a tilted claw grip, my primary contact points are my mid to low thenar, mid hypothenar, and high mid palm, but keep in mind since the upper shell is separated, the contact is split between the two upper regions of the shell. In terms of finger contact, my thumb rests against the upper left side of the shell, my index and middle fingers rest towards the end of the shell buttons, and my ring and pinky finger rest around the middle region of the shell's right side, slightly before the termination point of the side profiles, but they start to flare out with that unique roundness I just mentioned. Now before we move on, I wanted to quickly talk about these humps on the mouse's sides. These humps are designed to fill in your grip if you palm or extended fingertip grip the mouse, and to be fair, they do fill in those grips nicely with my hand size, but with claw grips or regular fingertip grips or smaller hands, these humps won't do much in terms of ergonomics, so they kind of feel a little pointless on this mouse. And speaking of grip styles, let's talk about the compatible grip styles for the Hypace. For small hands, roughly measuring around 11.7 by 7.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips, but the length of the mouse's shell might make it difficult to grip. For small to medium hands measuring around 13.5 by 9 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and maybe claw grips. For medium hands measuring 15 by 10 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm and claw grips. For medium to large hands measuring 16 by 11 centimeters, the mouse again will be best suited for palm and claw grips, and for larger hands measuring around 17 by 12 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips. Now you might have noticed that I didn't mention fingertip grip, and while medium to large hands, and large hands can technically fingertip grip the Hypace, it's not exactly recommended, as the humps in the mouse's sides can't interfere with finger placement as they flare out just before the mouse's natural balancing point where you naturally rest your fingers. And the lack of coating also makes it very difficult to fingertip grip the mouse as the mouse's shell is so slippery. With aftermarket grip aids, the mouse is easier to fingertip, but still not something I'd recommend doing as the humps in the mouse's sides does make the grip quite awkward. Speaking of coating, let's talk about that next. As I mentioned several times in this video, the mouse's outer ABS frame doesn't appear to have a coating applied to it as it feels like raw ABS plastic, similar to how the Keychron M2 and ROG Keras 2 Aces shells felt. And as such, the mouse does feel very slippery, specifically where you rest your fingers and especially on the mouse's main shell clicks. Now the rear-facing hump design with the gap does give this region better gripability than the rest of the shell, but even this region can feel quite slippery, especially during heavy use. So again, aftermarket grip tapes are highly recommended if you're considering the Hypace for gaming or intensive use, and again, I'm disappointed the mouse didn't have any grip tape included as it would make the mouse much better suited for its advertised use case. Alright, let's talk about the Hypace's main clicks next. As I mentioned earlier, the shell buttons are very oddly shaped since the shell thins so much towards the top of the mouse, so their design is rather odd. The buttons themselves are shaped similarly to the sides of the mouse, and they're mainly flat with a slight tilt to them. Sadly, there are no grooves in the shell buttons for your fingers to rest in, which is something I would have liked to see, as since the main buttons don't have a coating, they're very slippery, and due to their smaller surface area and their shaping, it's really easy for your fingers to slip off the sides of the front of the main clicks during use. The main buttons also have a good deal of wobbling to them, and they're not very well stabilized, so the shell buttons do feel a little loose when you press your fingers on them, which I'm not a fan of. On the plus side though, the shell buttons are technically indented into the mouse's shell since there's a sizable gap between the sides of the shell and the shell buttons themselves. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test for the main clicks here. Inside, the Hypace is using a rather unique switch which I personally haven't used yet, the Kale White Blade switches, which have a 100 plus million click lifespan. These switches are rated for a 60 plus minus 10 gram force operation weight, similar to Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot switches, and as such their actuation force feels average, feeling around a 5.5 out of 10 in terms of actuation weight. Now this actuation weight does slightly change depending on where you physically actuate the main buttons, as they'll be the lightest towards the tip of the buttons and the heaviest up towards the ends. Both main buttons do have a medium range of pre-travel and a medium range of post-travel, and I definitely like to see the pre and post-travel tightened up a little bit here, as it's just slightly too high for a gaming mouse in my opinion. But both the main buttons do have a decent snappy rebound to them, so despite their longer range of pre and post-travel, the main clicks are fairly spammable. And by default, the main clicks have an 8 millisecond debounce applied to them, or at least on my pre-release version they did, so if you do get the Hypace and you're going to use it for gaming, I'd recommend lowering this down to 2 or 4 milliseconds. Next, let's talk side buttons, as the ones here on the Hypace are rather unique. Instead of the traditional pill-shaped buttons we commonly see on most mice, the Hypace's side buttons are these large, angled, ridge-like buttons. But despite their odd shaping, they do have a decent surface area to them, and they're positioned pretty high up in the mouse's side shell, a few millimeters behind the mouse's sensor position and balancing point, so they aren't easy to misactuate. You won't accidentally hit them while gripping the mouse, and they're also ever so slightly forward tilted to match the shell's forward curvature. But oddly enough, while the side buttons look very pronounced from the mouse's side shell, they're actually the same height as the sides of the mouse, and the only reason they're even actuatable is that the side pieces tilt inwards at the top where the buttons peek out. So the side buttons themselves aren't nearly as pronounced from the side shell as I'd like them to be, and the only thing preventing them from being unactuatable is their larger surface area, as that does keep them semi-actuatable. And just like the main clicks, and the rest of the mouse for that matter, the side buttons don't have any coating applied to them, so despite their larger surface area, they are very slippery, especially during heavy use. Another disappointing aspect to the side buttons is their stabilization, as since they're so long, they're very wobbly, and with a slight bit of pressure you can make the side buttons move significantly more so than I've ever seen on any mouse I've tested. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test for the side clicks. Inside, we do have a rather familiar sight, as the Hypace is using the standard Wano Black Shell White Dot switches. As expected for this switch type, the side buttons have a fairly average actuation weight similar to the main clicks, feeling like a 6 out of 10 in terms of actuation force. Both buttons have a low range of pre-travel and a high range of post-travel, the highest I've ever seen on a set of side buttons. But on the plus side, the buttons do have a decent rebound to them, but the buttons don't exactly feel spammable due to the high degree of post-travel and also their lack of coating, weird sizing, and lack of pronouncedness from the side of the shell. Alright, and in terms of the scroll wheel, the Hypace is using a rather unique wheel, which is a much thinner wheel than we commonly see, and it's also slightly larger. The wheel is made out of clear plastic and has a thin rubber texturing wrapped around it that has an etched arrow-like texturing on it. Now, due to the wheel's slightly larger size, the scroll wheel is a little more pronounced from the upper frame than we commonly see a lot of scroll wheels. And inside, the Hypace is using an F-switch encoder, which gives the scroll wheel a scroll force around 6 out of 10, with slightly pronounced scroll points. Admittedly, they are a little weaker than I'd like to personally see, but they're pronounced enough to keep the scroll wheel fairly controllable. In terms of the scroll wheel click, the mouse is using a Kale pillar switch with a cyan plunger, something I haven't seen before. This switch is on the heavier side as expected, with an actuation force of around 7 out of 10, and because it's a pillar switch, its rebound is quite weak, so the scroll wheel isn't exactly spammable, but since it's a scroll wheel, this isn't the biggest issue. Alright, and in terms of connectivity, the Hypace supports 3 connectivity modes: wired USB-C, 2.4 GHz wireless, and Bluetooth. All the connectivity modes worked quite well for my testing, and I didn't run into any technical issues, but just keep in mind that using Bluetooth connectivity will cap your report rate to 125 Hz, so I wouldn't recommend using Bluetooth connectivity for gaming. Alright, and in terms of sensor and MCU, the Hypace is using the Pixar or PA 3950DMT5QU. This standard 3950 we commonly see in many high-performing mice on the market, but with one unique twist, as its DPI range is 50 to 40,000, not 50 to 32,000 like we commonly see. It has the standard IPS rating of 750 and 3 LOD levels, 0.71 and 2 millimeters. Ripple, angle snapping, and motion sync are all enabled on the sensor, and these can be enabled or disabled via the Hypace's web-based software. And as I mentioned earlier, the mouse's sensor is located forward in the mouse's shell, right at the mouse's forward balancing point. And in terms of MCU, the Hypace is using the standard Nordic 52840, the MCU we see in almost every single high-performance mouse on the market. Alright, and in terms of polling rates, the Hypace supports up to 8 GHz on both the 2.4 GHz and USB-C connectivity types, but as I mentioned earlier, the Bluetooth connectivity will cap your report rate to 125 Hz. Now, over my testing, the 1K, 2K, and 4K polling rates were all very well implemented on both wired and wireless. I wasn't able to test the 8K polling due to the age of my system, but the other polling rates were surprisingly well implemented for this being Hypace's first gaming mouse. Alright, now in terms of battery, the Hypace is using a 250 mAh battery. I was actually expecting to see a 300 mAh battery due to the mouse's size, but a smaller one is actually a nice surprise. Now normally I give my battery life estimates from my testing here, but I wasn't able to get any accurate reading on the Hypace's battery, as every time I refreshed the web-based software it showed a different battery level. So whenever I'd test the mouse, the estimated battery life that showed in the software fluctuated so heavily, so much so I wasn't able to get any accurate readings. Compared to other gaming mice that do use 250 mAh batteries and have a 3950 and a 52840 MCU, I would estimate the Hypace's battery life to be around 45 hours on 1K Hz, around 33 hours on 2K Hz, around 20 hours on 4K Hz, and around 13 hours on 8K Hz, but keep in mind this is a very rough estimate based off of cumulative data from other mice using the same specs, and keep in mind that power optimizations vary heavily from brand to brand. If Lofree does update the web-based software and fix the battery issues, I will redo my testing and post my findings down in the comments, but I'll have to wait for Lofree to actually update the software to do that. And in terms of charging, the mouse charges via its USB-C port, and the port is universally sized so you can use aftermarket cables here with the mouse, which is great to see considering the mouse's stock cable is pretty underwhelming, but we'll talk about that later. Alright, and speaking of software, let's talk about the Hypace's web-based software next. Now, just like all web-based softwares, it will only work on Chromium-based browsers such as Edge or Chrome. Now, the software's layout is fairly simple as it's separated into 4 tabs, but I did find the software kind of tricky to use as they've decided to use knob or wheel buttons, which is fine, but it's not exactly clear where you need to click or slide to adjust the values on these buttons. Hopefully we'll see Lofree make the software a little more visually clear so it's easier to use, as it was kind of hard to actually figure out how to adjust the settings. Now inside the software itself, on the first tab we can select the mouse's profiles, and the unit's onboard memory supports up to 4 profiles. We can also rebind the mouse's buttons, but the rebind options are fairly minimal. We can also see the mouse's battery readouts, which again as of this review aren't exactly accurate, and we can also adjust the lighting on the gigantic 8K Hz dongle, and you can set it to a solid color or to a variety of predefined patterns, and you can adjust the speed or brightness of these patterns as well. In the next tab we can adjust the mouse's auto sleep timer, set the LOD, enable or disable motion sync, ripple, and angle snapping, adjust the default debounce timing, polling rate, and DPI stages, and you can set up to 5 DPI stages per profile. There is also a high performance mode which can be enabled if you want to utilize that as well. In the third tab we have a fairly standard macro editor, and the fourth tab shows the mouse's current firmware and software level, as well as a repairing option for the 8K Hz dongle. But overall the web-based software here for the Hypace is actually pretty good considering this is Lofree's first version. Of course, visually the UI could be cleaned up a little bit so it'd be easier to understand where to click to adjust some settings. I would also like to see more key rebind options, and of course the battery readouts for the mouse are also very fluctuative, and hopefully we'll see all these things fixed before the Hypace hits the market. Alright, and in terms of repairability, surprisingly the Hypace is a decently serviceable mouse, but the channels for the primary anchoring screws are weirdly designed, so not a lot of screwdrivers fit inside them, which does make taking the mouse apart kinda tricky. And on the inside, if you want to access the mouse's PCB, you do have to remove the battery to access some screws, which I really dislike. But aside from these oddities, the rest of the mouse is decently serviceable, so it will be easy to clean, replace, or mod out components, especially batteries. And if Lofree decided to release future modular parts for the Hypace's magnesium core, replacing these pieces will be decently easy. But I'll talk more about the mouse's serviceability and modding options much more in the Hypace's teardown video that we'll be releasing soon, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. Alright, and next up let's talk about stock skates. As I mentioned earlier, the Hypace comes with no skates pre-installed and includes one set of dyed PTFE skates. Now the stock skates themselves are fine. These are the kind of skates I would expect to find on an office mouse, not a gaming mouse, and they are pretty average for stock skates. But aside from their dyed nature, my issue with them is their shaping and their positioning. Due to the elongated Hypace's shell, the skates are a quad level design consisting of a larger surface area top skate and even larger surface area middle skate and a tiny skate at the mouse's base as well as a sensor ring. But sadly, these skates are very thin. So thin in fact that they make the mouse very easy to tilt over when combined with the mouse's thinner shell. Ideally the mouse should have some stabilizers on the side pieces to prevent this, but in its current form the mouse is very tiltable when using it horizontally. Now some kinds of aftermarket skates are compatible with the unique skate channels here on the Hypace, but since they're so thin, even with aftermarket dot skates the mouse is still very easy to tilt. Now as I mentioned earlier, these skates remind me of something you'd see on an office mouse, not a gaming mouse, and the weird skate design and the thinness of the cutouts does heavily impact the mouse's gaming use case, as again the mouse is just very easy to tilt too much during use when you move it horizontally. For general office use this isn't an issue, but for gaming use when you're going to be moving the mouse back and forth horizontally a lot, this is a big issue. Alright, and lastly let's talk about the Hypace's stock cable. As I mentioned at the top of the video, the stock cable is a thicker cable with a semi-rough paracord wrapping around it. It is a standard USB A to C style, but sadly the USB-C end isn't tilted. Now due to the cable's thickness, it's not very flexible and it is quite rigid, so using it to take advantage of the Hypace's AK pulling rate is a less than ideal experience, and its thickness also prevents it from being usable with mouse bungees. When it comes to these stock cables, I feel like a broken record at this point, but I'll say it again, if you're going to ship a mouse with wired 8K polling, you need to include a cable that's not only compatible with bungees but also one that's flexible enough to not impede the wired usage. Thankfully though, as I mentioned earlier, the Hypace's USB-C port is compatible with aftermarket skates, so you can use a much lighter, more flexible cable that have tilted USB-C end here, and those vastly improve the mouse's wired experience, but the stock cable is just really poor in my opinion. Hopefully we'll see Lofree change the included stock cable to one similar to the Pulsar X2 series cables, as those are the perfect stock cable in my experience, and a cable like that included stock here with the Hypace would make the wired experience astronomically better. Alright, well in closing, overall the Lofree Hypace is definitely the most interesting release we've seen in 2025 so far, and while the mouse's performance is surprisingly good, the design of the mouse is just flawed, and Lofree's design philosophy of going against the safe shape trend has backfired, as instead of the Hypace feeling like a high performance gaming mouse, it feels like a fancy office mouse or a showpiece mouse. Of course, in its current form I do have a lot of other issues with this mouse, too many to recount here, but again I wanted to reiterate that the on-frame design has a lot of interesting potential, and with some R&D, I'd love to see Lofree release modular parts that have a real coating on them for the Hypace, as a wider shell would fix several issues of the current version. But even if Lofree leans into the potential modularity of the mouse's shell, the mouse's MSRP of $199 USD is way too expensive for a mouse with this many design flaws. Even at the cheaper Kickstarter pricing, it's still not worth it in my opinion, as there are so many mice that are so much cheaper that are better in almost every single way. So while the Hypace is an improvement when compared to Lofree's previous mice, this is not the high performance gaming mouse they're advertising it as it feels much more than a fancy showpiece mouse or a fancy office mouse, and this is a mouse I do not recommend getting specifically for gaming, as it is just fundamentally flawed in too many ways. But if you do want to learn more about the Lofree Hypace, you can check out its product page or their Kickstarter pages, which will be linked down in the video description. description. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Big thank you to our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you didn't know, members get an exclusive early look at all upcoming content here on the channel. So if you'd like to see new videos before anyone else, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, and Met Keys to save yourself a little bit off your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the Lofree Hypace, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.